back in James chapter 3. If you've got your Bibles, you might like to turn there because we're doing more than half a verse today.
Oh, wow. Wow. Amazing. The untamable tongue.
We're really following on from where I was last week. Last week was a little bit of an introduction to this week. So if you haven't heard this last week's message yet, go back and have a listen to that as well, because it will help fill in some of the blanks that we don't have time to look at today. So in a previous session, James devoted the bulk of the first half of this chapter on a very forthright and a very serious but practical critique of the use of the tongue. You might remember that one. Now, in the rest of the chapter, James carries on with a different subject, which we're going to look at today, another vitally important aspect of our lives, which, although less, shall we say, upfront and in your face as the tongue one was, but it also deserves our attention because it too has a huge impact on our everyday lives. There's quite a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm going to dive straight in without any preamble. Okay, so this is James chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it's earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Okay, so I think we need to remember that one of the main points that James has been making throughout this book is that the demonstration of true faith will always be shown through the works that we do, the things that we do. So he's already shown us that true faith endures trials, true faith cares for the vulnerable, true faith obeys God's word, and true faith restrains the tongue. See, James is seeking to show us the many practical ways in which our faith is outworked. And it's actually these things that mark us out as being different to the rest of the world. Now, as Christians, we're actually meant to be different. This is how Paul describes that difference. In Philippians 2, verse 12, he says that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. I think some translations put that as you shine like stars in the dark sky. So in today's passage, James is contrasting two different kinds of wisdom. There's the wisdom of man, or the wisdom of the world, which inevitably leads to conflict and disorder. And there is the wisdom that comes from above, from God, that leads to harmonious relationships. He describes worldly wisdom, and he doesn't mince his words here, as being earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Worldly wisdom leads to warped views on what things like beauty or success, marriage or morality, all those sort of things are. Whereas the wisdom that comes from God is pure, gentle, peaceful, merciful, and so on. There's a long list of attributes that we're going to look at later on. certainly worldly wisdom and God's wisdom are opposites and have very different fruits. Well, as always, it's good to put a little bit of flesh on the bones and just give a little bit of thought as to what we actually understand by the word wisdom. Now, if, like me, you were brought up with the stories of Winnie the Pooh, you will know that it's Owl who is the most wise. Certainly more so than Eeyore or Piglet or Tigger. And that got me thinking, why are owls associated with wisdom? Well, it seems that the answer, as ever, goes back to the ancient Greeks. In ancient Greece, the owl was the symbol for Athena, who was the goddess of wisdom and strategy. And it was said that an owl sat on Athena's blind side so that she could see the whole truth. And ultimately, the owl became adopted as the symbol of that higher wisdom. Actually, there's also a sort of metaphysical connection in that owls have very keen eyesight, and they can both see in the dark and actually can detect movement at quite a great distance.
They can turn their heads really.
Yeah, they really can. They turn their heads right round, don't they? Yeah. So these sort of these sort of attributes led the ancient philosophers to believe that the owl had some kind of supernatural power of knowledge and discernment. Well, according to philosophers, both ancient and modern, wisdom is something for which man should actively strive. Well, it was certainly something that was widely discussed by the philosophers of the ancient world. Perhaps the clearest summary comes from the writings of Cicero, who was actually a Roman poet and who was heavily influenced by Plato, Aristotle, Socrates and co. Cicero said it this way. He said, "Wisdom is the best gift of the gods. It's the mother of all good things, the best and that which generates all of the best." And that sort of sums up what most philosophers down the ages have said about wisdom. If you're going to go after anything in life, wisdom is the thing to go for. And actually, from a biblical perspective, wisdom is also something that we should seek after. In the first 5 chapters of the book of Proverbs, Solomon, the son of David, that God granted the gift of the greatest wisdom of any man that's ever lived, explores many facets of devoting your life to acquiring wisdom. And he sums up the wholehearted pursuit of godly wisdom in 2 conclusions. And they're the ones that we looked at last week. He says, you will understand the fear of the Lord and you will find the knowledge of God. And he says this in Proverbs 2 verses 1 to 5. These are the verses we looked at last week, but I just want to read them again just to undergird them. He said, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments within you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." Now, here's an interesting challenge for you. Get hold of a concordance and look up the word wisdom, and then check out all the references that it shows you. You'll be amazed by the breadth and depth of what the Bible has to say on the subject. Just to let you know, in all, that there are actually 234 references to wisdom, 181 in the Old Testament and 53 in the New Testament. So yeah, it's a big subject. So James, as ever, begins with a question. And this time it's not a rhetorical one. Who is wise and understanding among you? Now, be prepared, because we've seen James use this tactic once or twice in his writing. He asks a seemingly simple question and then springs a trap in the next statement. You can imagine if James was standing up in front of the church and asking that question, nobody would want to admit to not being wise, would they? We'd all claim to have wisdom if we were in their place. But now comes the hammer blow. You see, wisdom from James's perspective shows itself by the way that you conduct your life. How you live demonstrates whether or not you possess true wisdom. See, it's another one of James's tests to determine the genuineness of your faith. And again, it will show up in the way that you live your life. Trials, temptations, obedience to the word, righteous deeds, the tongue, they're all those tests of living faith. And now James adds another test, the test of wisdom. If your faith is genuine, the wisdom of God will clearly be seen in your life. And so James shows us some of the ways that the world's wisdom and God's wisdom are at odds with each other, so that we can determine whether we're following God's wisdom or just that of the world around us. And I don't think he's doing it to condemn us, but actually to encourage us to seek after the right kind of wisdom. And James uses the words wisdom and understanding kind of like synonyms. In other words, they can be used pretty well interchangeably with very little distinction between them. If there is a difference between them, it has more to do with their application than their actual shade of meaning. What do I mean by that? Wisdom, on the one hand, relates to how we apply principles, and understanding, on the other hand, relates to the knowledge of those principles. So in other words, wisdom has more impact on your conduct, whereas understanding has more impact on your mind. But basically, they all have to do with the same thing.
I mean, I tend to think of you need knowledge. Once you receive knowledge, then you need to understand that knowledge. Once you understand that knowledge, now you need to be able to apply it, and that's wisdom.
Yeah, that's right.
So wisdom is knowing how to apply the understanding that you've acquired from the knowledge that you have received.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's right. So to sum that up, you can't be wise if you don't understand, and you don't really understand if you're not wise. I hope that makes sense, but don't worry if it doesn't, because it's not a big deal. So in the world today, we live in a sea of opinions. And in that sea of opinions, everyone is an expert. Everyone has an answer. If you want to find out about something, you only have to look on Facebook or YouTube on any given subject, and you'll find multitudes of different opinions and advice on that subject, ranging from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the helpful to the facetious, and you just take your pick and you choose the answer that you think is right. And here James is asking, among all of you claiming to be wise and understanding, who is really wise and who's really understanding? See, that's the issues he's dealing with. And if we follow through the application of wisdom from the writings of the Old Testament, we find that true godly wisdom involves the ability to apply understanding to the things of everyday life. It's about practical living with skill and understanding. How do we show this wisdom? How do we show that we have the God-given ability to understand ourselves and understand our nature and understand God's truth and understand our world and understand our environment and understand God's revelation, so that we can live practically and wisely according to his will? How do we show that we have that wisdom? Well, in verse 13, James tells us that there are three ways that we can show that we have this wisdom. The first is by our good conduct or our good behaviour. It will show in our lifestyle, the way that we go about our everyday business. Now, the word good here means lovely or beautiful, attractive, noble, excellent, all those things that reflect the goodness of God shaping our lives. So the first thing that James highlights is the general way in which godly wisdom marks out our lives. But then secondly, he homes in on something a little bit more specific. Our works, our deeds, the things that we do. Every action that we take, everything that we do is consistent with our whole lives as evidence of the wisdom of God at work in us. So James says that it'll show in the totality of your life, but if you break it down, it will also show up in the smallest details of your life. It will show both generally and specifically. But there's a third way that it will show, and that's in your attitude. It will show through the meekness with which you approach life. Now, meekness, you might remember, it's about strength under restraint. We talked about a horse's bridle when we were discussing the use of the tongue, didn't we? The bit in the horse's mouth doesn't diminish the horse's strength, but it restrains it. It holds it back. So meekness prevents us from succumbing to arrogance. Meekness is not weakness, but strength under control. Remember what Jesus said about meekness in Matthew 11:29-30. He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart," that's meek, "and you will find your soul, rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So meekness in this context means to be under the control of God as you allow him to teach you how to curb the passions of the flesh and live by the power of the word and the Spirit at work within you. The wisdom of the world is arrogant. It's conceited and self-serving, whereas the wisdom of God is humble, meek, and non-retaliatory. Now, if you want to seek to understand more fully the difference between the wisdom of God and the wisdom of man, you need to go back to the Old Testament. In it, you'll find 5 books that are collectively referred to in the Hebrew Bible as the wisdom literature. Job, the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Now, each in their own different way give us a treasure trove of understanding the wisdom of God and how you can apply it to your life. And yet, apart from the Psalms, they're probably some of the least studied books of the Bible. But they will teach you the wisdom that can satisfy the heart of man and satisfy the heart of God, as well as making sense of life by giving it meaning. So I'd encourage you to dive into them, read them. Let the wisdom of God become instilled into your spirit and lodged into your heart.
It's really easy, really interesting. The next series of my Two Sisters and a Cup of Tea podcast is on Ecclesiastes.
Ah, there we go.
I should be in Ecclesiastes for the next few weeks.
So now for the rest of this morning, I just want to look at what James says is the difference between God's wisdom and man's wisdom. And the way that James does this is by looking at the fruit that each produces. Now we're going to begin with the negative stuff, the wisdom of the world, or man's wisdom. So let's just recap what James says about that in verses 14-16. "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it's earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice." Now, I heard a story of a man who was marooned on a desert island. Eventually, a ship came to his rescue. And as the captain of the ship came ashore, he discovered that the man had been there for 5 years. Looking around, he noticed 3 huts. So he asked the man about them. The man pointed to the first hut and said, "That's my home. That's where I live." And then he pointed to the second hut and he said, "That's where I go to church." "What about the third hut?" asked the captain. And the man replied, "Oh, that's where I used to go to church." It's an amusing story, but sadly, actually, it's one that reflects an attitude that's all too common. And it's at the heart of what James is referring to in verse 14. Even in the church, there can be conflict. Now, it's not wrong to defend the truth or stand on biblical principles, but there's a right way and a wrong way of contending for the truth. Now, there was certainly conflict in the churches that James was addressing, and that's what he's seeking to bring correction to. And it all stems from these two things: bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. The problem with worldly wisdom is that it builds its own world. It's a self-formed world and a self-focused world, and it has a bitter jealousy towards anyone or anything that threatens that world. And it's resentful of anything that threatens its territory, that threatens its accomplishments, that threatens its reputation, anything that threatens to disrupt its slice of this world. And it's potently self-focused, and anyone who challenges this world is an implacable enemy. It's consumed with ego fulfillment, and its goal is personal gratification at any cost. And what's happening here, the problem that James is addressing, is that people were boasting that they had godly wisdom, but their lives told a different story. They were proud, they were selfish, they were working for their own personal gain, and at the same time they were boasting that they had the wisdom of God. And James calls them out, pointing out that they were deceiving themselves and they were being false to the truth. The truth was what showed in the way that they were conducting their lives, and bitter jealousy and selfish ambition are clearly incompatible with lives that are directed by God's wisdom. So, says James, stop claiming what you clearly don't have. You see, the two negative traits, bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, both deal with hidden motives of the heart. They raise their ugly heads whenever we begin to compare ourselves with others, what they have and what we don't have. And one of the commonest ways that manifests itself, and we hear it frequently from the lips of children, is that phrase, "It's not fair." Usually it's an outburst of frustration because another child has something advantageous. But it all has its roots in jealousy and the perceived unbalanced scales of justice in the eyes of the child. The problem is, the world certainly isn't fair, and life isn't fair. And actually, if you read the Bible, you'll also come to the conclusion that God isn't fair, at least according to worldly wisdom. And that's the difference. You see, worldly wisdom uses a flawed value system that's based on equality. God's wisdom has a value system that's based on his sovereignty and his goodness. No, God never promises fairness, but he does promise his goodness. Worldly wisdom often begins with this comparing, resulting in depression and discouragement for some, and leading others to pride and being judgmental. In reality, worldly wisdom is not wisdom at all. It's just fleshly foolishness. It leads people to a competitiveness where they constantly try to outdo each other. And it even leads to stepping over and harming others to get what you want. It's this harsh and destructive envy produced by the worldly wisdom that causes fights and wars amongst friends, family, communities and nations. And James once again uses very strong, straightforward language when he describes worldly wisdom. He uses 3 words to describe it. 1, it is earthly. 2, it's unspiritual or fleshly. 3, it's demonic. Very interesting. What are the three enemies of all believers? The world, the flesh, and the devil. Earthly, fleshly, demonic. That's the wisdom that does not come from above. It's rooted in the three enemies of every child of God. It's earthly. That means it has many limitations. It confines man to this little box, the sphere of time and space, and we can't break out of it. All of this earthly wisdom has the mark of the curse of man's fallenness, manifested in pride and self-centeredness. It's the spirit of unredeemed humanity. Fulfill your own needs and desires. Truth is whatever you want it to be, because you are the center of your universe. Secondly, it's fleshly or unspiritual. And that means it appeals to and is driven by the flesh. Sensuality, sentimentality. Paul says that the nature of man, that the natural man cannot discern or understand the things of God. All of his values, his feelings, his impulses, his appetites, they all come from a fallen, corrupted system. And whatever he considers, it's from a purely humanistic, fleshly, sensual perspective, which has no absolutes, no boundaries, no constraints, and no real solutions. And then thirdly, James says it's demonic. Well, this tells us where it all comes from, doesn't it? Demons who have been made captive to this same kind of evil system of which man is also a captive. It's just what Paul said in writing to Timothy when he said that false teachers are really teaching doctrines of demons generated by seducing spirits. The kind of earthly wisdom that James is talking about here is spawned by demons. And it goes no further than the fallenness of man. And that's the way most people live. The wisdom of the world proceeds from evil spirits, from fallen angels. It comes straight from Satan and his agents, who disguise themselves as angels of light, when actually in reality they're ministers of darkness. And the only thing that restrains the world from a base animalistic existence is that God, in his grace, has sorted the earth with access to his divine wisdom, and that acts as a restraint. And then in verse 16, James leads us to the ultimate end of worldly wisdom. It breaks down into confusion, disorder, and every vile practice. In reality, it actually takes us back to the chaos that existed at the beginning of creation, before God moved to bring that chaos into order. And the word literally means to rise up in open defiance of authority. Worldly wisdom will never produce harmony because it excludes the only one who can bring about true harmony. And that's the first fruit of human wisdom: chaos and disorder, a state of instability. The second fruit is every vile practice or every evil work. At best, it means that human wisdom is worthless, corrupt, and good for nothing. James says that it opens the door to evil and every kind of wickedness. Well, that's the bad news. But now let's consider the alternative. Because having laid bare the disastrous consequences of following human wisdom, James now turns to the positive and the uplifting fruit that comes from following godly wisdom. So in verses 17 and 18 he says, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." In these two verses, James gives us 8 ways in which the wisdom that comes from God marks us out as being different from the world. Now, of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. There are many more that we could add. But the point is that if following worldly wisdom is productive in a negative way, then following godly wisdom is even more productive in a positive direction. And these are the fruits of seeking wisdom from God, resulting in works that are evidence of true faith. And when James says it's wisdom from above, he's actually just using the rabbinical way of referring to Yahweh. It comes straight from Yahweh, from God himself. You might remember how he described every good gift coming down from the Father of lights in chapter 1. Well, when I look at verse 17, I'm immediately reminded of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, because James reflects many of them here. Purity, blessed are the pure in heart. Peaceable, blessed are the peacemakers. Gentle, blessed are the meek. Full of mercy, blessed are the merciful. See, godly wisdom will produce all of these in the heart of the believer. These are the things that both Jesus and James say that we should seek after in the spirit of Proverbs 2. Seeking after them, making our ears attentive to them, inclining our hearts towards them, and crying out for them. So the first thing that James highlights is purity. That's what sets godly wisdom apart. It's pure, it's undefiled, it's clean, it's healthy. And not only is godly wisdom pure in and of itself, it actually also has a purifying power. It makes us pure. Actually, the word James uses here isn't the usual one used in the New Testament for purity. That word refers to moral purity, but instead James uses a word that connects it to our motives. It has the sense of being free from any kind of jealousy or selfish ambition. He's actually saying that wisdom that comes from God is the exact opposite of worldly wisdom, which produces jealousy and selfishness. It challenges our motives so that the wisdom we receive is used instead to glorify God and not to score points off other people or promote our own righteousness. But it's also a purity that, in the sense that it's untainted by any kind of impurity. See, because we're still a work in progress and our sanctification is still very much ongoing, what tends to happen with us is that we intermix a little bit of worldly wisdom with godly wisdom. So the whole thing is just a little bit skewed, which opens the door to compromise where we mix worldly principle with biblical principles. And your heart fights against your flesh. And that's what Paul says. In my inner man, I delight in the law of God. And in my inner man, I want to please God. And it's this tiresome flesh that keeps messing up the desires of my inner man. But there's a pure-heartedness in a true believer. So focusing on godly wisdom will purify our hearts so that in all that we do, we will seek after God's heart and his ways. Wisdom from above is also peaceable or peace-loving. It's the opposite of the unrest that worldly wisdom generates. It not only refers to freedom from anxiety and the inner turmoil of the heart, but it also means that we have a peaceable attitude towards others, seeking to promote harmonious relationships. True wisdom at all times works towards bringing people closer to one another and to God. And then James says godly wisdom is gentle. Strangely, the Greek word here is one of the most difficult to translate in the whole of the New Testament. It's not really the opposite of being violent, which is what we would normally consider gentleness to mean. It's a little bit like meekness. It's the quality of knowing when it's actually wrong to apply the strict letter of the law. It means knowing how to forgive when strict justice dictates that there is a perfect right to condemn. Such a person knows how to make allowances, when not to stand upon individual rights, and how to soften justice with mercy. And it always remembers that there are greater things in the world than rules and regulations. In the Beatitudes, Jesus says that you're blessed if you're persecuted and reviled, and when men say all manner of evil against you falsely. When it brings out in you this quality of gentleness, not looking for revenge, but taking mistreatment with kindness towards those mistreating you. That's the thrust of what this word means, and it can only come when we seek God's wisdom for our lives. Next, James says godly wisdom is reasonable. It's open to reason. It's not stubborn or obstinate, not demanding its rights or its own way, but it's willing to yield. It's quick to listen, it's teachable, and it's compliant, yet without any hint of compromise. So it's used of a person who willingly submits to things like military discipline, and it adheres to legal and moral standards in life. And there are two facets to what this word means. The first is that it's ready to obey, especially when attuned to hearing God's voice. And the second is that it's easy to persuade, not in the sense of being pliable or weak or manipulable, but willing to listen and skilled in knowing when wisely to yield. And then godly wisdom is also full of two things: mercy and good fruits. Firstly, full signifies an abundant measure, full to the utmost, what we would call stuffed full. And what is it full of? Firstly, mercy. Now, there are many applications of mercy. It really means a deep concern for people who are suffering, a demonstration of kindness and compassion, even if the cause of their trouble is their own fault. See, mercy isn't just a feeling, but it's actually a practical action, showing a tangible concern for someone in serious need. Godly wisdom opens the door for us to extend the mercy that we've received from God towards others. And godly wisdom is also about being full of good fruits. And again, the emphasis is on the abundant supply. If the tree is good, the fruits will also be good. And by walking in the light of godly wisdom, your life will be marked by a plentiful display of good deeds, works produced by a genuine faith that has transformed the heart. Then the next thing that James highlights is that wisdom from above is impartial. And that, of course, means that you treat everybody equally: the poor, the rich, the young, the old, the beautiful, the less attractive, the strong and the weak, those from different ethnic backgrounds or skin colour. When the world exalts one and dishonours another, God's wisdom leads us to believe that all people are made in the image of God to reflect his glory, and therefore each person has great dignity and purpose. But actually there's another shade of meaning that this word conveys, because it can actually also be translated as unwavering. Now, this speaks of a certain steadfastness, especially in our relationship to God, and not changing with all the winds of opinion and circumstances. See, God's wisdom is conveyed through his word, which is consistent and unchanging, which means that the wisdom gained through the application of God's word will bring about an unwavering and an unshakable certainty in our lives. Worldly wisdom speaks in uncertainties, things like having an open mind or suspending judgment. Godly wisdom is based on God-given certainties that come to us through Jesus, who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And then finally, godly wisdom is sincere, or more literally, without hypocrisy. If you translate the Greek word literally, it comes out as judging in secrecy. So the wisdom that comes from God is transparent and without any hidden motives. Therefore it's stable and trustworthy. If we're seeking godly wisdom, we cannot indulge in any kind of play acting. Whereas in the world, actors perform to receive applause, for others to see and to think well of them. But we in the kingdom of God, guided by God's wisdom, we focus on the audience of one. So James concludes his comparison of worldly wisdom with the wisdom from above with a summary statement regarding the characteristic of God's wisdom. He says that a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And the point of what James is saying is this: righteousness and peace don't happen by accident, whether in a family or a church, the workplace or a nation. It must be patiently laboured for, just like a farmer works for the harvest. Now, worldly wisdom naturally leads to sin and discord in our communities. And sin and discord are actually the default setting. So we shouldn't be surprised when they arise. But to have peace and righteousness in our relationships, as believers, we must faithfully sow patience, impartiality, endurance, mercy, and other good works, even in the midst of seeming chaos. We need a bigger vision. Sometimes we need to let our imagination loose when it comes to our expectation of what God can do when we put our trust in him. See, God's wisdom can achieve greater things than we often expect. When James says that a harvest of righteousness is sown, we need to expand our vision as to what that harvest might be. We need the faith of the farmer planting acorns who says he's sowing an oak forest, or the one who's planting wheat in the spring who's sowing next winter's bread. James has provided for us a prescription for living in peace and harmony through seeking to live by God's wisdom. But that harmony is threatened by worldly wisdom, which lurks in all of our minds and can result in us trying to accomplish God's work in our own ability and in man's ways. Now, James has laid before us the consequences of following worldly wisdom, leading to discord and chaos, and he counsels us to apply godly wisdom in our personal lives and in our relationships in order that we might reap this harvest of righteousness and peace. Two of the world's greatest needs are righteousness and peace. And as those with God's wisdom, we are the ones who sow them as we bring Jesus into every situation. And I want to finish with a verse that I hope will help us to keep pressing in, even in those days when it feels like a bit of an uphill struggle. Galatians 6 verse 9. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Amen.